Arturia's Synclavier V is great for sound design, greater than you think. Let me show you. Synclavier V is Arturia's version of the original New England Digital Synclavier from 1981. And when I say version, I don't mean an emulation, because according to them, it is the original Synclavier's code in software form. So it's pretty much the Synclavier. Now, without going too deep into the history of it, because that's not the point of this video, I want to talk about the sound design. If you have heard Michael Jackson's Beat It, of course you have. If you've heard Genesis Mama, or pretty much any sound from their album from the mid-'80s, or if you know the X-Files theme, all that was done on the Synclavier. Even though I think that one might have been the 9600 and not the Synclavier II. Well, anyway, this is Arturia's Synclavier. Let's get into the sound. When you open up Synclavier, you're met with this page. You can do a little bit with this page, but no, we're not staying here. We're going to go into Screen, and this is where we see the main pages for this. Now over here we have several different tabs. The Engine tab. This is where our carrier and modulator waves are. This is pretty much where the sound magic happens. Over in the Mixer tab, we have things like volume, panning, tuning, transposition by semitones, transposition by octave, chorus fine-tuning, and FM amount, FM ratio, and fine-tuning for FM amount. Over in the next tab, we have envelopes for both the loudness and for the harmonics, which is our modulator wave, and we have our LFOs. In key dynamics, this is where we can set things like FM amount and volume, depending on your key position. And we have our modulation matrix. This is where we can set any control to any parameter that we want for each partial. Now let's talk about partial for a second. A partial here, there are 12 partials in Synclavier V. On the original Synclavier, there were only 4. A partial is a modulator-carrier pair, so they're not necessarily oscillators because each partial has 2 of them, but you only hear 1 of them. And finally, the last tab that we have over here is just for FX and master settings. Over here in the Engine tab, we have our carrier and modulator waves, as I pointed out before. And beneath them, we see sine waves. FM mostly deals with sine waves and then adding harmonic overtones with modulation. And this is why we don't really see things like sawtooth waves, triangle waves, pulse waves, other types of waveforms, usually. But I'm going to go back over into the Mixer tab and give this sound a little bit of modulation amount. So right now, we just have a sine wave. And it sounds like that. Let's add some modulation. Bit of an annoying sound, I'm sorry. Let's go right there. But we can control how much modulation that we are giving it in different ways. So let's go over to the Engine tab and click on this little node in this window here. And down here, we see it says modulation. We have a number at 100. We can set a value between 0 and 100, and this changes how much modulation that we give it overall as well. But this is important to remember. This knob setting that we have here in the Mixer tab determines the maximum modulation amount that we're giving this sound. From here, we can get even finer with how much modulation we're giving it with this setting right here. So if we want the maximum setting for whatever we've set here, we can set it to 100 or any setting between 0 and 100. But we can also change the amount in the envelope, and we can hear that effect here. But as you probably heard, there is a bit of a hierarchy in how much modulation that we're giving it. And it starts with the maximum amount that we have here with this knob, and then we go over to envelope, and this shapes the overall sound. So if we want the maximum amount from this, we set this node, or the peak node right here, to the maximum. we can set it lower, but then we have this set to the maximum as well. So clearly, this is the last stage of modulation that we can get. And we could get pretty fine with this too. So that is modulation. That's a bit much. Let's bring that down. Of course, you can set it. Cool. Now, unlike with other FM synths, the Synclavier deals with oscillator pairs. You just have one modulator per carrier, and there isn't a flexible modulation matrix for you to send whatever oscillator into whichever other oscillator you want, like you can with, say, FM8. So with this, we are just stuck with one modulator per carrier for each partial. But that doesn't mean that we can't get complex sounds, because the Synclavier, to make up for that, gives us the option to do additive synthesis. Yes, additive synthesis. Look down here. Look down here in this little pane, and we have these tealish, turquoise-ish, whatever color that is, these bars. And look at what's happening to the sine wave. It's going quiet and then going loud. We can add harmonic overtones to both our carrier and modulator waves if we wanted to. And this gives us the option to make more complex sounds, whereas with other FM synths, it would just rely on modulation. That's pretty nasty. Ooh, that's even nastier. So just sine waves. And now I'm adding overtones. Sick. You can add harmonics up to the 24th harmonic, which means if you wanted to make a sawtooth-like sound, which it happens to be a preset for both of these waveforms down here. If you wanted a sine wave or a sawtooth wave, just hit that. Square wave, you could hit that. And a triangle wave, you can hit that. One thing you can do with additive synthesis with a sawtooth wave is you can fake resonance sweeps. Yes, you can totally do that. Now right here I have a sound that is set up with a sawtooth wave, but we have right here a little bit of loudness in the higher harmonics. Now, on a subtractive analog synthesizer that uses sawtooth waves, a filter with a bit of resonance will generate a sort of peak at certain frequencies, and if you were to sweep that down with an envelope or something else, then that peak would shift downward, and this peak emphasizes certain frequencies, not just one frequency. Well, I mean, depending on how resonant it is. But you'll have a number of frequencies really close together that are louder at the point of the cutoff. And we can do that here by raising the loudness of certain harmonics. And in order for us to sweep, I've added a second point here where I filtered out all of these higher harmonics and I just have these ones down here. So let's listen to it. Except it doesn't sound like a sweep. And that's what's going to lead us into the next section when I talk about frames. But for right now, we can see in this window, look at this little purple node. Look at you. Look at you. He's just going across from one to the next. That's because these two frames, they're called frames, they are settings. And I'm not sweeping between them, but blending them. And that's why it sounds like we're going from a bright sound to a low sound, but we're not really sweeping. For us to do the sweep, what we actually have to do is have multiple frames here between these 2 points. And for each of those frames, have these settings gradually go down the harmonic series. See that? Each frame has the loudest harmonic decrease. And this sound actually sounds like this. It's quite a distinct fake resonance, almost like it's self-oscillating. Nice. Now, to get that last sound sounding the way it did, I had to utilize the frames. What is a frame? Now, over here, this is the frame window, and it's basically a set of the total duration of the sound. And within it, we can set frames. Each of these frames is a point in time where we can set different settings for everything in this page. Anything in this page can be different between these 2 points. So, for the basic partial, let's say I start with a sine wave. Next partial, I want to add some overtones. I want to add another one, add different ones, and then change the volume, maybe even pitch it up. For the next one, do this, add some harmonic overtones to the modulator, and then pitch it back down, and then have it go back to sine wave. I can make it do this. The settings that we have for these frames can be drastic like this. Maybe they could be more subtle, like you're only doing a little bit of a pitch variance or harmonic modulation variance. You could do fake sequences, fake arpeggios, and other things like that with the frame window. I have the basic partial, or the first frame, set up, frame prime, if you will. I'm going to add a second frame. By default, what happens is it's going to reset to a sine wave. So I can click on the first one, hit copy, and then click on the next frame. It's going to automatically paste this information here. I'm going to do the same thing here. Just makes it easier for taking settings and setting them to each frame so that if I wanted to make edits per frame, I could do that later. But let's say I wanted to just have a sound like this and maybe do something with the pitch, right? Instead of just changing the overall sound. But let's go and do something with this. And maybe stretch this so that it's a loop. And I can set a loop to either only go forward or go forward and backward. And I don't actually have any modulation amount here, so let me add some. And by the way, I do have modulation amount set in the mixer right here, just a little bit, but I've had the first frame set at 0. So the next frame I'm going to give some more. You can hear the brightness coming in. Okay, so there is that. I'm going to add a frame here, copy this information here, and set the loop here instead. Now watch what happens. I'm going to copy this to the next partial down, and I'm going to set this frame apart just a little bit and change the length of these frames. Now what's going on is we have a little bit of a conflicting kind of sound going on because they're going at different rates. Now I'm going to tune it down a little bit. Another thing that you can do with frames here is if you have two sounds, like for both of these partials here, you can set the tuning for them to be different. So you can kind of get a pitch envelope if you want, because there is no pitch envelope in the envelope tab. But you can fake that over here by changing the tuning of one frame to the next. You can kind of get that sort of, that cheesy 80s synth brass type thing. So stuff like that can be done. Now let's say, for instance, you wanted to have a complex sound and you wanted to bring the modulation amount down over time using an envelope like this. You can hear it a little bit. You can go even further by using frames to bring the modulation amount down, but you can also control how many harmonic overtones in that modulator wave or even in the carrier wave are over time as well. So this is resolving to a sine wave, which you may not want. So let's, just for the sake of this, copy that over here, copy this setting over here. Now for frame 1, why don't I change this to be louder than this, and this to be louder, and maybe even that. Ooh, interesting sound. Let's make this quieter, maybe bring that in. Let's bring these down for the next frame over, and make this quieter as well. Maybe bring the modulation amount down even more. And of course, while that's going on, we can change the harmonic envelope so that even with the modulation settings in the engine tab very low, we can make it go up from the very beginning and get stuff like this. I know I'm not playing the most interesting thing right now, but whatever. So stuff like that. Now, here is a multi-part sawtooth sound, and it sounds like this. It sounds a little bit louder at the very beginning, as opposed to the rest of the sound, because everything, when every partial plays at once, they play in tune, or in other synths, this would be called key sync. And to change that so that not everything is perfectly in sync, or at least it doesn't sound like everything is perfectly in sync, we can do a few things to change this. One of the easier things that I think would be to go into the envelopes page and change the attack slope, but also to change the delay of some of the sounds. So even just slight is enough. So let's say 5, let's say 2, 2, let's say 15, that's not 15, that's 10. Let's do 10. 10, and then maybe that one will be the non-delayed one. Now, of course, that means that we're not going to have a perfect attack for the sound, but still gives us a big sound without us having that very, very hard attack at the very beginning. This is a very crude FM percussion type loop that I've set up, and I've entirely done it with frames here. So the first sound is this kick drum sound, and I've had it so that you can actually sync this so that it loops in time, and you can set the frames so that it lines up in this grid right here. What I have going on is the very first sound, the very first frame of the sound is at 100% volume and modulation. The next one is at 0 for both of these, and I've transposed it down to give it a bit of pitch bend down, to kind of give it that kick kind of quality. The next frame is also 0, but I have 2 frames next to each other. So in order to keep this region quiet instead of it ramping up to loudness, is I have to have another frame with these same settings over here. And then the frame immediately next to that jumps up in volume again to make the attack of the second kick drum. And then I have it going down to 0, and then back up to 100 again for these two hits next to each other. This is two kick drum sounds. This is two kicks next to each other. Da-da. Da-da. And then this is at 0, and this is the end of the loop region, and then it goes right back to the beginning. The second sound is the snare, and it's pretty much the same thing going on. I have a loop set to a different frame because I don't really need to have this set up twice to do it, since it is pretty much the same sound throughout the entire loop. Same thing is going on here. The very first frame has all this information going on, but it's set to 0 and 0, and then it jumps up in volume for frame 2. And I have it changing quality just a little bit. It doesn't sound like it's changing much as it goes down, but I'm kind of making it a little bit more distorted as it kind of gets quiet near the end here. And then it just starts back over at the loop. This next sound, each of these is a bit of a hi-hat sound, and it starts at highest volume, goes down to 0, then it goes down to 0, jumps up, and that pretty much carries on throughout this entire sequence. So you can fake entire FM percussion or FM drum sequences with this. And it doesn't have to be drums or percussion. It could be really any sound that you want. Frames. Yay. I want to go back to the engine page and specifically the additive part right here because I want to show you something. We have this first sound. The bar is all the way up at the top, but listen to what happens when we bring it down to near 0. We have 8-bit. The Synclavier can do 8-bit type sounds. The key to doing these types of sounds with Synclavier is to bring all of the loudness for the carrier waves down as close to 0 as you can. I think it has to do with the bit depth of the Synclavier, but don't quote me on that, I'm not totally sure. Seems to make sense to me. But for, let's say, a sawtooth wave, instead of having everything up here like this, we bring it down here as quiet as we can. Bring it a little louder than that. Okay. And of course, like what I showed you with the frames, you can make those 8-bit arpeggio sounds. Perfect. The Synclavier V can also do sampling. And the sampling that the Synclavier does is kind of interesting, and you can hear this here. You hear that? It's a little bit of bit distortion the lower I play. And it's really prominent down there. I don't know if that's the bit depth or a combination of bit depth and sample rate, but the Synclavier has this thing where samples, when they're played lower, and I think even some of the FM sounds too, there's some digital artifacts that come into play and some distortion, and they may not be pleasant to some of you, but if you're into sound design, that can be really cool. Something I've found with this is that if you want to have that distorted sound, what you can do is take a sample, whatever the sample it is, and then resample it up an octave, up 2 octaves, up 3 octaves. And then when you import it into the Synclavier, have it mapped to those higher octaves, but then play it back down, and you can get some really, really crunchy digital sounds. For instance, here are some drums. Now for these drums, I actually recorded them straight, and then I resampled each drum hit up an octave, up 2 octaves, and then up 3 octaves. And then when I imported them into Synclavier, as you can see down here, I've set them to those higher octaves, and then I'm playing them down at the original octave. Now if you go over into the FX Master tab, you can set the bit depth, and this kind of works to a degree, but I found that if you really want those extra crunchy sounds, resampling is the way to go. It just sounds better to me, in my opinion, anyway. This is actually similar to the method that artists would use when using things like the SP12 or SP1200. Because of the limited sample rate and bit depth, they would record records at twice as speed, or an octave up, so that they could get a higher range out of the pitch than if they were to record it straight on. And when doing that and then pitching it back down, because of the limited sample rate and bit depth, you would get that digital artifact into the sound, and it would give it a very crunchy quality. And so the Synclavier is able to do that. Now, if you take a sound that isn't drums, for instance, let's say you have a different sound, like a synth sound, and you pitch it up, or resample it up 2, 3, maybe even 4 octaves, and then set it up 2, 3, or 4 octaves, and then play across the entire range, you can get a very distorted sound for everything. And one of those sounds is this. Nice. But let's say you don't want that quality of sound. Let's say you just want samples in this instrument that sound normal. Well, the thing that I showed you earlier is that it seems to only affect notes that are below middle C. So as long as you have a sample that is at middle C and up, you don't have to worry about resampling anything. But for lower notes, it would be better to have a lower sample, or if you resampled your one sample, because let's say you just want one sample. If you resample that at a lower pitch and then map it to a lower pitch in Synclavier, you can actually get rid of that effect to a degree. One cool thing about the sampler in Synclavier is that you can still use the modulator and give it some FM. You don't have to just play it as a sample. Let's add some harmonics, and let's add some modulation. I've just turned what is, I think, otherwise like a melodic percussion type sound into a harpsichord or a clavichord type sound. Look at that. So yeah, that's one good thing about this, is that unlike normal samplers, you could just add FM to it, to whatever the source is, synthesis or a sample. But perhaps even cooler than that is that you can resynthesize samples in Synclavier. So right here, I have the sample picked. And let me turn off modulation for just a bit right now. This is our sample that I'm using, but if I want to resynthesize it, I would have to go down to any of these three buttons down here first. And this is carrier, both, or modulator. And I can analyze the information from this sample to either the carrier wave here, the modulator wave, or I can apply this information to both. So let's do carrier wave for right now. And we start with this. Now, in order for us to resynthesize it and get something similar to the sample that we have to add frames to differentiate each part of the sound. And you can hear how it's kind of reanalyzing the sound and turning it into something else. But let's go and do something interesting. Did you hear that? Did you hear how it changed from what it was before, a very bright sound, to this? You hear that? That's because each of these frames that I have set here is capturing information at that point and then blending between these 2 points. So, if a sample, and I found this out, if a sample has more variation in a certain part of the sound, in my opinion, it is better to have more frames at parts of the sample where there's more variation in the sound so you can get that detail. But for parts where there is a little variation, like here, you don't need to add more frames for this, because listen to what happens. Okay, it's still a little hard to hear, but there is a lot of fluttering going on if you have more frames in a sustained part. So you don't really need this many frames. Just a few frames is really all you need. Let me bring these frames over here to where all that detail is, and then remove these. Let's apply that, and boom, our frames are set, and our sound is set. Now, the thing with resynthesis for this is that you can have the sound tracked to the pitch, but whereas with a sample will be sped up or slowed down, and therefore the sound will be longer or shorter depending on where it is on the keys, these frames are set where they are, so the duration of the sound, no matter what the pitch is going to be the same. And this is one of the benefits to resynthesizing your sounds. Now, not every sound is going to sound great when you resynthesize them, particularly things like string samples or woodwind samples. But that doesn't mean that you can't get interesting stuff out of those types of sounds either, especially when you add FM to them. Let me just go back and add FM to this. Still have a bit of a pluck sound to it, but as we've heard, since the sample was kind of up an octave, I've actually resynthesized it so that it tracks to the lower octave. If I turn this off again, the sample, you hear the sample? Sample is at that note, and the synthesized sound is down here. That's because I've set the key for this to analyze to at C3, even though this is probably a C4. Got a violin sample set up here, so let's analyze it to the carrier. We have nothing, because I think the very beginning of the sample is completely quiet. Yeah, look at that. Nothing right there. So let's add that. And we have a very bright sound right here, but you hear how it's very crunchy at the very beginning because of the bow on this violin. So we've got that going on. More frames for more detail, but then listen to how this sounds later on in the sample if I have more frames down here. We have that detail at the very beginning of the sound. And since the sample doesn't really have much changing throughout the sound, it sounds pretty much the same for this part here, so we don't need too many frames here. It doesn't totally sound like a violin, but it is pretty much the Synclavier's way of resynthesizing it to sound somewhat like a violin. So let's apply that. Now why don't we actually find another sample to resynthesize and kind of make a little bit of a section. Okay, we need more frames for more detail. Now, one of the things you might be hearing, and you might notice if you were to do this on your own, is that if the sample has any kind of pitch variance, it's going to try and force that to whatever pitch we have here that we're playing with our note. It's going to force those phases to play a consistent in-tune note, and that's why you'll hear a little bit of a weirdness with the sound, especially near the beginning, because the sample has that kind of dip in pitch just a little bit. And so that's what we have here. Let's apply that. Let's go back to our mixer and tune that down just a little bit and listen to what these sound like. Very synthetic indeed. Not so much like strings anymore, but that's kind of what you get with a crude resynthesizer. But that doesn't mean you can't get other interesting things when you combine sampling, resynthesis, and even modulation to the resynthesized sound, or even to the sample, and then bring all of those together. One thing I didn't touch on so much yet is the LFOs. Over in the envelopes and LFOs page, we have our LFOs down here, and we can set it for vibrato and stereo or tremolo, and we can change the rate of the LFO, and we can change how much it affects the carrier and modulation, and we can have them linked so that they're both affected, or we can just affect one or the other. So we have our rate. We can change to a very high amount, and almost get like another FM type sound over here because the rate can get so high. Or we could get something like this. And as I said, we can affect either just the carrier, just the modulator, which can get us stuff like this, which is kind of a cool sound. But we can also do LFO type stuff with frames. Again, I did touch on this just a little bit, but over here, let's say I have this sound and then this. I am going to show, I'm going to do something. So this first frame, I'm going to leave it alone. But the second frame, I am going to reduce the pitch to something crazy like 100, 200, no, 125, that's the maximum. So 100. That's what I'm going to do. That's not enough. So I'm going to make the first sound go up to 100. Okay. And I'm going to loop this. Back and forth. So here we have a sort of LFO type thing going on, similar to what we have in the LFO page, but what I can do here is add another node, another frame, excuse me, right here. And I'm going to bring the volume down to about 20. So now I've got another LFO affecting the volume of the sound. But wait a minute, I'm going to add some more frames right here and right here. And this is going to be modulation amount. So because I've bisected the LFO for the volume, with here being 20, because I want it to go from 100 to 20 to 100, these in the middle are going to be set to 60. And I think I also changed the pitch too. Yeah, the pitch is also affected too. So this is at 100. So this will have to be 50. This will have to be minus 50. And this will be 0. But what I'm going to do here is change the modulation amount. And the modulation amount is going to go down to 20. I don't know, I guess I just like the number 20. Now what I've got going on here is essentially the equivalent of 3 different LFOs, but they're affecting more than just the pitch and more than just the stereo. I actually don't think I can affect stereo here. Yeah, I can't affect pan here at all. But anyway, if I want to modulate different amounts like FM amount, volume, and pitch, I can do all of that here in the frames. Now, the thing is, if you do it this way, you do have to conform everything to where you've set your frames to. If you wanted different rates for different things that didn't necessarily line up to something rhythmic like this, you might have to add in more frames. Or if you just wanted to have pitch being affected by the LFOs, you don't have to change the pitch here at all. But everything would have to conform to where you set the frames in the frame window. Well, that doesn't mean you can't do more complex stuff than that. Now, with LFOs, you can set different rates and different amounts for each partial, and you don't have to have exaggerated settings. You could have something very subtle, like I have here with this cathedral organ. It may sound like there's nothing going on there. There's a very subtle LFO going on for each of the partial, and they're all at different rates, and they're all at different amounts. And it's very, very hard to hear normally. But if we were to compare this to the other sound where there is no vibrato, there is no LFO going on, versus it's very subtle, but it's there, and it helps to make the sound just a little bit bigger, because with everything perfectly in tune, especially with reverb on it, sometimes you can get into that kind of quality where it sounds just a little bit too kind of weird. I don't really know how else to describe it, but yeah, having a little bit of vibrato, even just slight vibrato, very subtle vibrato like I have here, can give a little bit of a kind of a subtle semi-chorus type sound. If you go through the factory library, you might hear some pretty crazy presets that you don't really know how to fit into your work, and you might feel is not very useful. But it's still possible to have sounds that are simple, but versatile and useful, like the sounds in the track that you're listening to right now. For these sounds, I've used most of the techniques that I've already showed you, from FM to additive, resynthesis and sampling, and some framework. All of that and more can be done in Synclavier V, from insane stuff to subtle stuff, from period 80s stuff to modern stuff if you want, from lo-fi, chill, to really big, bombastic, and weird. All of this stuff can be done. You can do sequences, you can do arpeggios, you could do layers, you could do stacks, you can do very big, heavy chorus sounds, or very simple, very mellow, simple sounds with just one partial. That's the Synclavier V, it's great for sound design, and that's the video. Thanks for hanging out and watching, and I'll see you again some other time in some other video. Later.